She was being auctioned with her newborn until a lone mountain man appeared with a rifle. Red Gulch, Montana, spring of 1873. Wind swept red dust across the cracked boards of the town square. Around the auction block, men stood shoulder to shoulder, boots planted in dirt, faces hidden under wide-brimmed hats. They waited, not for cattle or tools, but for a woman. Brenda Bell stood on the wooden platform, her baby clutched tightly against her chest. The infant whimpered, shifting in her arms, too young to understand fear but close enough to its shadow. Brenda's eyes were dry, jaw clenched, spine straight. She wore a worn dress, one sleeve torn, her dark hair braided tightly. A rusted sign at her feet read, "Debtor, Brenda Bell, female, one infant, sold for labor." The auctioneer banged his gavel. "We'll start at $50 for the woman and the babe." Laughter broke from the crowd. "I'll give 60. 65. And she cooks naked," someone jeered. Brenda didn't flinch. Her arms tightened. She searched the faces. None were kind. Her father, Reverend Jonah Bell, had once stood here, calling for mercy. That world was gone, and so was he. Silas Cromwell leaned against a post, toothpick between his teeth, coat too fine for a town choking on soot. He studied Brenda like a wolf watching a tethered calf. He had buried her father, taken their land, and now came for what was left. 80, Silas said smoothly. The auctioneer perked up. 80 from Mr. Cromwell. Do I hear 90? Brenda stared him down. She knew what he wanted, to own her name, her dignity. 90. The crowd stilled. That voice didn't belong. A man stepped forward from the edge of the square. He was tall, broad, his coat made of tanned hide, boots still caked with snow from the trail. A rifle hung across his back. His beard was streaked with gray, his face unreadable. Beside him walked a small girl, no older than 5. She clutched his hand, eyes wide, wearing a wool dress and handmade moccasins. Around her wrist, a bracelet of grass and bark. He stepped forward again. The crowd parted without a word. "I said," his voice rang calm and low, "stop." The auctioneer faltered. "Sir, bidding has already begun." "I'm not bidding." Murmurs rose. Silas pushed off the beam. "Who the hell are you?" The man did not look at him. "Name's Thorne Boone." Recognition flickered in Silas's eyes. Thorne faced the crowd. "This ain't justice. It's a public hanging without the noose. You men cheer for what would have made your mothers weep." "She's a debtor," Silas snapped. "This is law. No, this is you, clinging to power with dirt on your hands." Thorne unstrapped the Remington and held it across his arms, not aimed, but visible. His gaze swept across the men. No one drew. He turned to Brenda. "You want to walk away with your child?" She hesitated, eyes on the rifle, then on the girl beside him. The baby stirred. She nodded. Mira, the girl, released Thorne's hand, stepped forward, and pulled something from her satchel, a tiny ring of woven grass and dried flowers. She crossed to the platform and placed it beside the baby's blanket. No one laughed. Silas spat. "Touch her, Boone, and you'll be dead by sundown." Thorne finally met his eyes. "Then you best start digging." Silas's hand twitched near his holster, but none of his men moved. Thorne set the rifle at his feet and raised a steady hand. Brenda stepped down. No tremble, no pause. Her fingers met his. Mira reached for the hem of her dress. Together, they walked through the parted crowd. Dust followed their heels, and not a soul dared stop them. The trail north of Red Gulch narrowed into a path choked by pine roots and melting snow. Thorne Boone moved steadily, rifle slung over his back, eyes scanning the forest with the quiet vigilance of a man who trusted nothing but instinct. Behind him, Brenda Bell held Luke close to her chest. The infant stirred now and then, warm against her coat. Mira, small and silent, walked beside Thorne with practiced ease, never falling behind, never wandering far. She cast glances back at Brenda, cautious but curious. They crossed 2 ridges before nightfall, then descended into a wooded hollow where a stream curved through moss-covered rocks. A small cabin stood tucked between trees, its roof low, chimney stone dark with age. "This is your home?" Brenda asked quietly. Thorne nodded. "For now?" Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, a straw mattress in one corner, and a cot made of elk hide in the other. Brenda stood near the doorway, unsure. Mira set down a small basket of roots and walked straight to the hearth, stacking kindling. Thorne lit the fire. He didn't speak unless necessary, but everything he did carried an unspoken invitation. "You're safe here. You may rest." That night, Brenda fed Luke by firelight. Mira sat across from her, legs crossed, hands folded on her lap. The child stared at the baby's mouth, suckling, fascinated. Brenda smiled gently. "His name is Luke." Mira didn't answer but tilted her head, eyes wide. After a long pause, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wooden bead, then placed it on the floor between them. "For him?" Brenda asked softly. Mira nodded once. Thorne watched from the shadows. He did not interrupt. He only turned back to the stove, stirring a pot of porridge. In the days that followed, routine emerged. Thorne rose early, checked traps, brought in meat. He boiled water, mended torn sleeves on Brenda's coat, and left food by the hearth without a word. Mira shadowed him silently, but sometimes lingered near Brenda, especially when she sang softly to Luke. Brenda observed everything, how Thorne brushed frost from Mira's hair without speaking, how he placed pine cones near the door to keep animals from entering, how he carved Mira a spoon from juniper wood. At night he sharpened his blade in silence. His eyes often drifted to the fire, far away in thought. Brenda asked him one evening, "How long have you lived like this?" "7 winters," he answered. "And the girl?" "She was 2 when I found her." Brenda looked at Mira sleeping beside Luke on the elk hide mat. "Where?" "On the trail after a raid. Her village burned. You took her in. I could not walk past." Brenda was quiet for a long time. "That's not something most men would do." "I am not most men," Thorne replied without arrogance. One morning, Brenda stepped outside and found Thorne hanging herbs near the window. She handed him the baby's torn blanket. "It needs stitching," she said, "but I don't know how." Thorne took it, examined the fray, then nodded. "I'll show you." Later that afternoon, as Brenda clumsily followed his sewing guidance, Mira sat beside her, watching intently. "You're a patient man," Brenda murmured. Thorne looked at her, then at the baby in her arms. "Some things are worth the time." They heard the riders before they saw them. Around dusk, the sound of hooves echoed from the western slope. Thorne stood instantly, his eyes narrowing. He motioned for Mira and Brenda to stay inside. He walked out into the trees. Minutes passed. When he returned, his voice was low but calm. 4 men, not lawmen, Silas's scouts. They did not come close. "Will they?" Brenda asked. Thorne met her eyes. "They know who lives up here." Brenda looked down at Luke, then over at Mira by the fire, chewing on a strip of dried apple. "I do not want to run again," she said. "You won't," Thorne replied. That night he stayed up long after the fire died down, his rifle across his knees, gaze fixed to the trees outside. No one slept easy, but no one knocked on the door. Spring passed slowly in the high woods above Red Gulch. Mornings came with mist along the creek and the smell of pine smoke rising from Thorne Boone's chimney. Life settled into rhythm, quiet, spare, and in its way, peaceful. Brenda no longer jumped at every sound. She began rising before dawn, feeding Luke, fetching water with Mira, and learning to move through the forest without snapping branches beneath her boots. Her hands grew rougher, her eyes steadier. Mira, once quiet and watchful, began to speak more. She pointed at birds, asked questions about plants, and one morning looked up and said clearly, "Miss Brenda?" Brenda turned, surprised. "Yes, sweetheart?" Mira nodded as if testing the words, then tried again. "Can I call you Miss Brenda?" Brenda crouched beside her, brushing a stray hair from the girl's cheek. "You can call me anything you like." Mira smiled, then skipped ahead toward the creek. Thorn watched from the cabin doorway. "She has not called anyone anything in over a year." Brenda rose. "Then I am honored." Some days, Thorn took Brenda into the woods. He showed her how to check a snare line, how to tell rabbit tracks from fox, how to taste the water from a spring and know if it ran clean. One afternoon, as Brenda wandered behind the cabin searching for firewood, she found something unexpected, a small grave. It lay under a lone fir marked by a carved wooden cross, simple but lovingly made. A strip of red cloth was tied around the base, and pine cones had been placed carefully at its foot. She stared at the marker. There was no name. Later that night, after Mira had gone to bed, Brenda asked softly, "Who is buried behind your house?" Thorn sat still by the hearth. He did not look at her. "My wife," he said. "Her name was Sani." Brenda waited. "She was Shoshone," he continued. "I met her during a mapping patrol. The army thought her village was hostile. It was not. We married in secret. I left the service, tried to build a life away from war." His voice grew quieter. "They came for her anyway." Brenda placed her hand over his. Neither spoke again for a long time. Days later, a storm swept through the hills. Wind howled between the trees, and rain battered the roof like fists of stone. Brenda insisted on helping Thorn tie down firewood under a tarp. They were soaked within minutes. By nightfall, her cough had deepened. The next morning she could not rise. Her skin burned. Her breath rattled. Thorn touched her forehead, then looked at her lips, dry, cracked. Luke cried beside her, hungry. Mira stood frozen in the doorway, clutching her doll. Thorn moved fast. He wrapped Brenda in blankets, tied her to his back with rope, and handed Luke gently to Mira. "Stay close," he said. "Do not fall behind." They left the cabin just after sunset. Snow still clung to the shaded roots along the trail. The creek had risen with the rain, and twice Thorn had to wade across, gripping Brenda tight. Mira followed with Luke, tucked inside a sling made from Thorn's cloak. Hours passed in silence but for the wind and Luke's soft whimpers. They reached a lantern-lit hut in a rocky hollow by midnight. The door creaked open before they knocked. An old woman stood there, wrapped in fur, her face marked with soot and age. She recognized Thorn at once. "You brought her too late," she said. "I had no choice." She ushered them inside without another word. Brenda was laid on a bed of animal skins. The woman crushed herbs, lit a mixture of smoke and steam, and pressed cool paste against Brenda's neck and chest. Mira curled on the floor, clutching Luke. Thorn sat by the bedside. He did not speak. He did not move. At dawn, when the old woman drifted off by the fire, Thorn remained where he was, fingers tangled in Brenda's hair. He bowed his head, and for the first time in many years, he whispered a prayer. The fire crackled low in the hearth. Morning light filtered through the gaps in the shutters, casting lines across the fur blanket. Brenda Bell stirred. Her head throbbed. Her body ached. She opened her eyes to see Thorn Boone seated beside her. One hand rested gently on her forehead. The other held a damp cloth, which he laid across her brow with practiced care. "You're safe," he said quietly. "Fever broke a few hours ago." Beside her, Luke shifted beneath the blanket, wheezing softly in sleep. Brenda reached for him with trembling fingers. Thorn helped guide the child into her arms. Mira lay curled near the foot of the bed, clutching a carved rabbit. She had not left Brenda's side. Brenda blinked, throat dry. "How long?" "3 nights, Thorn said. "You almost didn't make it." She turned her head to him. "You carried me?" He nodded. "To a healer, someone I trust." Brenda rested against the furs. "Thank you." Thorn looked into the flames. You deserve to know the truth." She glanced at him. He did not meet her eyes. "I was a scout," he began. "U.S. Army, Fort Henry. I mapped tribal lands, tracked trails, marked water sources. I was good at it." He paused. "Too good." Brenda stayed silent. "Command ordered a raid. Said the village was hostile. We surrounded them at dawn. It was quiet, too quiet. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't speak. Maybe I was afraid. Maybe I didn't want to look weak." His voice dropped. "When the shooting started, it wasn't a battle. It was slaughter. Old men, women, children. They ran. They screamed. My captain called it a cleansing. I stood in the center of it all." He swallowed hard. "My wife was there. Her name was Sani. I married her in secret the year before. She was Shoshone. She lived in that village." Brenda's breath caught. "She was shot before I reached her," he said, eyes locked on the fire. "By one of my own. I held her until she bled out. Then I saw a little girl hiding beneath her body. Still breathing." His voice cracked. "She was too. I carried her out. I deserted, never went back." Brenda reached across the space between them, placing her hand over his. For a long moment, there were no words. When she finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "You saved her." He nodded once. "She saved me." Tears welled in Brenda's eyes, not out of pity, but recognition. The quiet horror, the weight of surviving what should have never happened, it lived in them both. Outside, a crow cawed from a branch. Miles away, in a smoky saloon back in Red Gulch, a notice had been nailed to the wall. "Reward, $200 gold, dead or alive. Widow Brenda Bell. Infant, trespassers." Below it, Silas Cromwell's signature. The notice reached the wrong kind of ears. 3 men read it over mugs of whiskey. Garth Cold Eye. Tall, with a glassy stare and no moral compass. Johnny Crick. Short, cruel, quick with a knife. Old Dan, the woodman. Silent, brutal, always chewing something. They took the job before the barkeep finished reading it aloud. That night, the mountains breathed cold and still. Brenda, feeling stronger, stepped out to wash a few garments by the stream. The moon hung low, casting shadows across the rocks. She rinsed Luke's blanket, unaware of the figure creeping behind her. Back in the cabin, Thorne paused, his hand halfway to his rifle. A chill ran down his spine. He stepped outside and scanned the tree line. His boots moved silently across the grass. Then a twig snapped. Brenda turned. A hand grabbed her shoulder. "Do not scream," Cold Eye hissed. But before he could move further, a shot rang out. Crack. Johnny Crick dropped behind a log, blood spraying across the stones. Thorne emerged from the darkness, rifle raised. Cold Eye shoved Brenda forward, trying to run, but Thorne fired again. The second man fell. Old Dan, seeing both his partners down, fled into the trees, wounded in the leg by shrapnel. Brenda scrambled to Luke, shielding him with her body. Her hands shook. Thorne stood over the bodies, his jaw clenched. Blood darkened the cuff of his sleeve. Back inside, Mira whimpered by the hearth. Thorne entered, set the rifle down, and checked the door locks in silence. Brenda sat on the floor, cradling her son, her dress soaked with mud and Thorne's blood. He didn't speak. He just stared into the shadows beyond the shuttered window and said softly, "We can't stay here anymore." The path into Hidden Bear Valley wound through dense pines and narrow rock gaps. Mist clung to mossy roots, and the air held the scent of wet bark and melting snow. Thorne led in silence, rifle across his back. Mira followed close and quiet. Brenda trailed behind, Luke tucked against her chest. Her eyes flicked behind them often, haunted by the last ambush. They all felt it. Danger still lingered. 2 days passed before the trees parted. A wide valley opened below, dotted with homes, raised on wooden stilts. Stone chimneys sent smoke curling into the gray sky. A clear stream wound through the center. Barefoot children darted between gardens and drying racks. Brenda halted. "This is the last place I was welcome," Thorne said. He moved forward, hands open. Villagers stepped from the shadows, bows ready, spears upright, gazes sharp. One man emerged, gray streaked his long hair, leather cords tying it back. His beaded vest glimmered faintly. His face revealed nothing. "Nawane," Thorn said respectfully. He knelt, placed one hand on the ground, then pulled a small drum from his pack. He struck it 3 times, deep and slow. The sound rolled across the clearing. "You return with ghosts," Nawane said in Shoshone. "I return with truth," Thorn replied, "and no raised weapon." Brenda stood tall beside Mira, who clung tightly to her side. Nawane stared, then gestured. They were allowed in. They were housed in a small guest lodge at the village's edge. Brenda helped cook, gathered herbs, tended Luke and Mira. Though she worked in silence, eyes followed her. No one offered welcome. Then, one night, a scream split the quiet. A young woman had gone into labor too soon. Her mother wailed. The midwife stood frozen. "I can help," Brenda said softly. Doubt flickered, but fear won. They let her inside. She worked through the night, guiding breath, steadying the girl's hands. Sweat soaked the furs. The baby arrived at dawn, red and howling. The girl's mother fell into Brenda's arms, whispering thanks. The next morning, children shyly approached as Brenda knelt, tracing letters in the dirt. "This is A," she told them, "like an arrow." Laughter followed, and they mimicked her sounds. From afar, Nawane watched in silence. Days later, by the river, he spoke to Thorn. "You brought a woman who carries the strength of 2. I know. She bleeds for others. She has not stopped," Thorn answered. At dawn, 2 days later, hooves echoed beyond the ridge. Warning drums beat low and slow. Thorn stepped from the longhouse, blade at his hip. Brenda stood firm in the doorway, Luke in her arms. Mira held her hand. Silas Cromwell rode into the village, 10 armed men behind him. Their rifles were clean. Their eyes were not. "Boone," he shouted, "I know you're here. I know what you're hiding." Villagers gathered, forming a silent line between the homes and the intruders. "You have 1 minute to give up the woman and the child," Silas barked, "or this place turns to ash." No one moved. Thorn walked forward. Nawane flanked him on one side. An elder warrior with a spear stood on the other. "You set one fire here," Thorn said evenly, "and the mountain will remember you." "You think they'll die for you?" Silas sneered. "They're not dying for me," Thorn replied. "They're standing for what you'll never own, honor." The silence deepened. Wind curled between them. A rider shifted in his saddle. Silas's finger twitched. Then Nawane raised his hand. 20 bows lifted in perfect unison, aimed at Silas and his men. Silas spat. "This isn't over." He turned his horse sharply. His men followed into the trees. Thorn stood still, shoulders squared. Brenda moved beside him. "What now?" she asked. He stared toward the peaks. "We prepare." The sky cracked open like a warning drum. Dark clouds rolled low over Hidden Bear Valley. Thunder groaned, and hail began to fall, pelting rooftops and slicking the dirt paths with white stone. It sounded like hooves, fast, relentless. In the center of the village, Thorn Boone stepped forward, soaked, his coat heavy with rain. In one hand he held a leather-bound journal, swollen and frayed with age. Around him, the villagers gathered in silence. Brenda stood clutching Luke, Mira close at her side, faces tense beneath their cloaks. From across the clearing, Silas Cromwell rode in with 10 armed men. Their rifles glinted beneath the storm. Silas's wide-brimmed hat shadowed his eyes, but his mouth curled with anticipation. Thorn raised the journal high. "This belonged to Jonah Bell," he called, "preacher, truth-teller." Silas's eyes narrowed. Thorn opened the journal. Rain dotted the pages, but the slanted handwriting remained. "In here are records," he continued, "lies bought with gold, lands taken by force, witnesses silenced." A murmur ran through the crowd. Thorn turned the page. August 5th, 1868. A deed signed under duress. Land transferred to Silas Cromwell. The witness had been dead for 2 days. He turned again. September 3rd, 1870. A bounty issued. The target? A Shoshone woman, my wife. Color drained from Silas's face. You expect them to believe that? I don't need to convince them, Thorne said. From the circle, an elder stepped forward. His eyes were clouded, but his voice was steady. I saw those signatures. I saw the treaty burn. A woman followed. My husband lost our land after a contract we never signed. Brenda's voice rang next. My father wrote this to protect truth. And truth, Mr. Cromwell, has a voice that doesn't fade. The hired guns looked at each other. Doubt spread. The air grew still. Silas snarled. You think words will stop this? He drew his revolver, but no one moved. No rifles raised. One rider backed away. This isn't what we came for. Another lowered his weapon. You're on your own. Silas turned, but the crowd had closed in. All around, eyes stared back, calm, unafraid. Thorne stepped forward. He didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he pulled a small bundle from his coat. He handed it to Brenda. She opened it carefully. Inside lay a wooden cross, worn, chipped, but warm. I found it in your father's chapel, Thorne said. I've carried it for years. Why? She whispered. Because he saved me, and so did you. Rain softened around them. Brenda folded the cross back into Thorne's hand. Then give it to the man you are now. Silas alone dropped his pistol into the mud. Nawane stepped up. This ground no longer fears your name. The villagers moved. Silas was bound and taken away. Thunder echoed once more over the ridge. The hail stopped. Thorne and Brenda stood beneath a clearing sky. Water ran from their clothes. Heartbeats slowed. The storm had passed, and with it, a chapter closed. The air after the storm was still. Silas Cromwell had been taken, the weight of his crimes finally dragging him from the saddle he once ruled from. The village returned to a cautious peace, but inside Thorne Boone's cabin there was only motion, quiet, determined, and final. He rolled his blanket tight, checked the edge of his knife, and strapped his rifle across his shoulder. Mira watched from the corner, silent, her hands clutching a worn toy rabbit Brenda had sewn from scraps. She did not ask where he was going. Thorne could not look her in the eye. He stepped out into the dusk without saying goodbye. Beyond the village, a narrow trail wound through the forest to a mossy ridge overlooking the falls, the place where he had buried his wife, where he had spoken to the trees more often than to the living, where no one asked questions of the dead. But someone had followed him. He heard her before he saw her, the hush of a skirt brushing fern, the soft tread of boots on wet earth. Brenda stood at the edge of the clearing, her arms crossed, hair pinned back, with the same stubborn fire she had worn on that auction block. I knew you would come here, she said softly. Thorne turned away. I needed space. Space from what? She asked. From me? From them? Or from the part of you that dares to want something again? He did not answer. She walked closer, her voice firm now. You can keep running, Thorne. You've gotten good at it. Bury the past under pine needles. Leave before anyone can need you too much. He still did not look at her. But I am not your past, she said, and neither is Luke or Mira. We are standing right in front of you. You just have to choose. He clenched his jaw, fists tightening at his sides. Brenda, I am not a man who deserves a second chance. Her voice softened. Then do not take it for yourself. Take it for them. Silence stretched between them. Then, at last, he turned. His face was wet, not from the mist, not from rain, but from tears he had not shed in years. His voice broke on the edges. You are the one thing I never let myself dream about, he whispered. Brenda stepped forward. You do not have to dream any more, she said. You are allowed to live. He reached out slowly, like a man afraid the moment might vanish. She did not move away. His calloused hand cupped her cheek reverently, and he leaned in, not for her lips, but her forehead. A kiss of promise, of pain softened, of walls falling at last. She closed her eyes. So did he. And for the first time in years, Thorne Boone stood still, not because of fear or guilt, but because someone had given him a reason to stay. Spring returned to Hidden Bear Valley with wildflowers blooming between the roots of pine trees and the rivers running full with meltwater. At the edge of the forest, beneath a ridge that caught the morning sun, stood a small log cabin. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. Chickens pecked near the steps. A garden lay freshly turned, green shoots already breaking through the soil. Inside, laughter echoed off wooden walls. Brenda knelt beside a low table, helping a group of children, Shoshone and settler alike, trace letters into clay tablets. Mira sat proudly beside her, correcting a younger boy with surprising patience. "Not E backwards, Jonah," Mira said gently. "Like this." Brenda smiled and ruffled her hair. "You are quite the teacher now." Mira blushed, but did not deny it. Outside, Luke waddled through the grass on unsteady legs, arms stretched for balance. His giggle carried like birdsong. Thorne walked behind him, a slow and steady shadow, watching every step with silent pride. Later, when the sun dipped low, painting the valley gold, Thorne sat alone at the work table by the window. A sheet of thick parchment lay before him, a pot of ink. The old wooden cross rested nearby. He dipped the quill, hand slow but steady. Then he began to write. "Emily, a year has passed since the snow melted over your grave, and yet not a day slips by that I do not think of you. You were my first light. You were what tethered me when the war tried to unmake me." He paused, watching Luke through the window, now playing with Mira beneath the cedar tree. "I thought I had nothing left but shadows, that I would wander the ridges forever, talking to wind and ghosts." A breeze stirred the curtain. But then came a woman with fire in her eyes and a baby in her arms. She reminded me that the world does not only take, sometimes, it gives back. She was not you, but she carried the same strength you loved, the same kind of hope I had long buried. He looked toward the hearth where Brenda was rocking Luke, humming a lullaby only the mountains could hear. I did not know I was allowed to live again. He signed his name carefully, then his voice, low and rough with feeling, spoke the final line aloud. "I have found a reason to live again." He folded the letter, tied it with twine, and placed it beneath the cross. Outside, spring continued its gentle work, and the man who once believed he had no place left in the world now had a home. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the chill of the mountain wind, the heat of a stolen glance, or the weight of a love born from ashes, then don't write off just yet. Hit that like button to keep the fire burning, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable tales of love, loss, and redemption on the American frontier. Every story here is a tribute to those who dared to love in the lawless lands where bullets missed, but hearts didn't. Until next time, partner, ride safe and love brave.